Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to Commercial Law and Ethics, our introduction and beginning with Chapter 2. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad to have you here today. Are we fired up and ready to go? I hope you are. I know you're in the right place, and hopefully you're not freezing today. It's about zero here in Vermtown. That famous Greek philosopher Socrates, once observed that the only educated man or woman is the self-educated one. And so I think my purpose with you this semester is going to be that of a guide more than a teacher. And so consider me sort of a Sherpa, which is a Indian from India guide who helps people find their way to Mount Everest. So I'm looking to take you to the intellectual Mount Everest. And how am I going to do this? Well, I'm going to do it by hopefully providing material for you that is scintillating, provocative, and didactic. That is material that will sparkle, stimulate you, and hopefully convey information in a interesting and exciting way. So it's going to be like riding a mechanical bull with some drunk putting in quarters. Hoo-ah! We can do this. We can do this. Honest, we can. So let's see. If we had a face-to-face class, I normally would move you around, get you in alphabetical order. So there you are at home. I want you to move over 2 seats just so I can keep my rhythm going here, okay? All right, the syllabus you should have and hopefully looked at before now, because it covers, I hope, all the important information that we have. And if you look at the chat room for this week, it should give you in detail all the information you need about the course. But I invite you to send me any email inquiries that you may have about anything contained in the syllabus. I wish I could say I'm Professor Perfect and everything goes according to perfection, but I don't think I would fool you. And so when things don't go just right, especially in terms of technology, don't hesitate to give me a call or send me an email. Okay, hopefully nobody's been injured yet, but again, I encourage questions. So let's see. I'm not going to appoint a Chief Justice in this class because I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of work for you to do that I normally would do in a face-to-face class. So let's start our journey together, which I think beginning with Chapter 2 is a good place for us to break in on this circle of ethics. And I think the question, we ought to ask ourselves initially with this subject is, why does business need ethics? What do you think? Certainly, to whom much authority and power is given, much is expected. But we know that mankind is not a perfect species, that we engages in error in judgment at different times. And so let me give you a particular problem, ethical problem, and we're going to take it apart here. This is a case I call the Ronald Thump Real Estate Investment Trust versus the hapless, helpless, hopeless Tilly. So let me share with you the facts. So we've got this Thump Real Estate Investment Trust that owns a high-rise apartment complex in Minneapolis. Now, it has a housing contract with the federal U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to provide what we call Section 2 or low-cost housing to 2,000 elderly, handicapped, mentally disabled citizens who cannot afford their own housing due to inability to work. Now, the annual real estate investment trust HUD contract is coming up for renewal in January. But Congress has not passed HUD's budget, and the government appears headed for another shutdown. Does that sound familiar to you, boys and girls? When the government shuts down, the Thump REIT will not be paid. Now, the anticipated death struggle between Republicans and Democrats appears headed for a many-month delay as elections approach towards November. So the Thump REIT has conducted its own market survey and determined it could re-rent these same apartments leased by HUD for 25% more than HUD is paying. Now, the Thump REIT sees an opportunity here to increase its bottom line. But where will the 2,000 impoverished souls go? So these are the issues that you're presented with. First, what is the ethical decision for Thump to make? And second, what basis do you make your decision on? How do you make your decision? What is it that helps you decide correctly? So, first we want to identify the stakeholders, right? Because the stakeholders all have a stake in this particular business problem. Certainly, we have the Thump management. Second, we certainly have HUD, the governmental agency. You know, they're not the ones passing the budget, yet they're the ones that have to administer it, and they're the ones caught in the middle on this. Third, of course, the tenants, the 2,000 impoverished tenants. And lastly, the shareholders of the Thump Real Estate Trust certainly have a stake in this outcome. So, what is the ethical decision for Thump to make? And on what basis is the decision made? Interesting thought. Interesting thought. So, I think we begin by, of course, understanding what is ethics. All too many people think ethics is gray and means different things to different people. Oh, and it's really complex and very difficult to define. Poppycock! Untrue! False! Ethics is really easy to define. Socrates defined it as correct decision making. Now, let me prove why I think Socrates is right in saying ethics is simply correct decision making. You all have heard about the Wells Fargo credit card and line of credit scam that 5,300 employees at least engaged in which they were encouraged, incentivized by management to create 8 new accounts. 8 is great was the theme, the tagline used for their campaign internally to motivate and incentivize their workers to try and get their current clients to open up additional lines of credit, credit cards, and other types of financial accounts. But the problem is that was hard to do. And so at least 5,300 employees decided to take the low road and open up such accounts for checking account and savings account holders in Wells Fargo. But they did it without the approval or the consultation of those account holders. In other words, they engaged in fraud, false representation of a material fact, opening up credit card and line of credit accounts without the approval or knowledge of their account holders. So I would hope most right-thinking people would say, gee whiz, I think that conduct by those 5,300 employees was wrong. And I think that's why they were fired. But besides that, they were also guilty of civil fraud and criminal fraud. But there's one more characterization I think that applies here. Could we all agree that they were unethical in the conduct they engaged in by opening these accounts without the approval of the account holders? I think we could probably get agreement that that is what unethical conduct looks like. Well, if that is true, then let's flip that over on the other side. What does ethical conduct look like? Since we've just had a preview of what unethical conduct looks like, or wrong conduct, ethics would stand to reason to be correct conduct, correct decision making. Or, as my friend Mr. Socrates liked to say, ethical conduct is doing what one ought to do. So, that is the question certainly presented in our Thump Real Estate versus the hapless Tilly residents of the high-rise. What is the correct thing to do? What is the correct decision here? And then how do you decide? What basis do you use for deciding? Now, students in my classes, I divide them up into groups of fours. Why four? Because I have each one take one of the stakeholder positions to discuss their stakeholder interest and what ought to be done. And I only give them about 15 minutes. And then, I ask them, okay, so what'd you all come up with? And now, clearly, we've got four stakeholder interests that have discussed their interest, obviously not in a vacuum, but in the context of everybody's interest, to answer the question, what is the ethical thing to do? And to my delight, the vast majority of groups report back, as I have them report in class, what is their decision and why, how did they make it? Invariably, they all come up with what I call workarounds. That is a business term that we use when we're faced with a problem, and a direct decision is not easy to make. And so we find workarounds, ways to ethically resolve the problem or the dilemma based on some particular set of principles. And so people talk about moral, duty, that business has a duty to give back to society, not to take revenue from society. And so the business has an ethical obligation to do what ought to be done. And so frequently, moral principles or values, if you will, help incentivize us or guide us, act as a compass as to which direction we should go in. And what delighted me with my group of four students is they would invariably report back that they came up with a workaround. Now, while it wasn't a perfect decision, yet, it shared the problem with everybody, and to greater or lesser degrees, groups accommodated, compromised for the right reason, coming to a decision that would, at the end of the day, not displace or evict the 2,000 residents. So, how do we decide correctly when we're conflicted? Because you can imagine if you, operated in a vacuum and said, look, I only am interested in the shareholders' point of view. I just don't care about anybody or anything else. All I'm concerned about is shareholder value and return on our investment. I mean, is that the way the world really works? Is that the way business really works? I would suggest no. That is not the way the world really works. That people who are corporations and companies making decisions try for the right reason to do the right thing. And that's where the business term, which is frequently used when faced with complex difficulties, we do workarounds. We find ways to work around the problem. At the end of the day, I would suggest where there is a will to do a workaround, there is always a way to find a workaround. Pope John Paul, now St. John Paul, came up with this phrase that I think is really apropos here. He says, the freedom to choose inherently includes the obligation to choose correctly. What an interesting philosophical perception. The freedom to choose in our American society inherently includes the obligation to choose correctly. Therein lies the problem, of course, or the challenge of, so how do we choose correctly? And that's where ethical principles come into play to guide us when we are conflicted. Are law and ethics the same? What do you think? Well, I think upon reflection, many of you would come to the conclusion that the law provides a moral minimum beneath which conduct may not fall, or society will apply sanctions. So, for example, the 5,300 employees who cheated and engaged in fraud at Wells Fargo, the law has sanctions for that type of behavior. And so at a minimum, their employer, Wells Fargo, fired them. And their ability to find a replacement job is going to be a challenge. Does one, and ethics, of course, is a higher, or if you will, aspirational level that certainly is above the moral minimum. So what is the ethical thing to do in the thump real estate situation? That's quite different than perhaps a legal approach. A legal approach might be, geez, we just kick them all out and initiate a new program with lease rates that are 25% higher than we had with the government, and. But is that the ethical thing to do? While it may be legal, it's not ethical, and I think the students come to the right conclusion. So how about these, questions? I have students that ask me from time to time, trying to discern legal from ethical responsibilities. Do we have a legal duty to stop a toddler from running across the street into oncoming traffic who somehow escaped her handler? Well, most of you probably know, well, no, I don't have a legal duty, but wow, I certainly have an ethical duty. And that's a good illustration of the moral minimum and the aspirational ethical approach to decision making. Does one have a legal duty to report employee theft or corruption? How about that? What about student cheating? Do you have an obligation, an ethical obligation to turn in student cheaters? How about the problem of Union Carbide in 1984 in Bhopal, India? Union Carbide, an American company, owned this petrochemical plant in Bhopal, and it exploded due to the negligence of a number of workers there, all Indian. But they subsequently filed a class action lawsuit for damages. There were like 1,000 Indians who were injured and killed in this toxic chemical explosion. And the federal court dismissed the case based on the doctrine of what's called foreign convenience, that it was not a forum for a proper forum to litigate this case, because it should have been litigated in India. So the forum non-convenience doctrine is a judicial doctrine that holds, look, the case should be litigated, that is, it should be tried in the area where the offense was committed. Well, of course, the reason why the class action lawsuit was brought in the United States was because we didn't have caps on pain and suffering and death like they have in India, which is like only $500 to $1,000. And so that's what brought them to sue in the United States. Well, they had to go back and sue in India, and that was quite a catharsis. And while there was a judgment, it was small in comparison with what they would have obtained in the United States. But Union Carbide went above and beyond the judgment to try and address the claims and the injuries of the Indians that lived around the petrochemical plant. Research does show that people who think out the right rules for living are less likely to go wrong. True or false? There's actually a lot of truth to show that. So folks that people who are heavily religious, for example, who really base their lifestyle around the Golden Rule, the Ten Commandments, so forth, they, by and large, is research that shows that because they reflect about what's right, they are less likely to do wrong. How about this? Should companies consider all stakeholders or just shareholders? I think today we're seeing that most companies consider all the stakeholders involved, because that's good business. To consider employees, to consider shareholders, to consider the local community, and so forth. Who are the stakeholders? I think I've already given an adequate example of that. Now, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman from the University of Chicago, he likes to say, look, business should only be concerned about one thing, making a profit. That's it, nothing else. Should not be concerned about the other stakeholders or the impact on the community. It says as long as you stay within the bounds of the law, a business's only concern should be making a profit. Wow. Think about that. It's only about making a profit. Can you imagine all of us coming to your funeral, and there we are in the graveyard, and you've been laid to rest, and they've got a headstone that they're going to erect with your name and birth date and death date on it. And on the headstone is written, Freddie Schmudlap increased the value of his company 200%. Can you imagine that on your headstone? Is that the sum of your existence? Really? So I think it's true. That is the most profitable option in business, the most ethical choice. It may not always be, but it may very well be the correct choice. Are employees' self-respect as important as profits? There's a lot of research to show that, yes, the employees are very much concerned about their own self-respect and self-image. How about this? Does research show consumers are willing to pay more for a product they believe to be ethically produced? Yeah, there is research to show that. Unethical behavior in an organization creates a cynical, resentful, and unproductive workforce. Is that true or false? Think about it from your own experience. Yeah, there's research to show that it does create that type of climate. Ethical companies are more likely to win financially, have a better reputation, more creative employees, and higher returns than those who engage in wrongdoing. True or false? So how's it going at Wells Fargo? How's it going at Enron? How's it going at WorldCom? How's it going at HealthSouth? How's it going with all those folks? Not going very well either. So what do they all have in common? So that brings us to ask this interesting question. Now, when I'm conflicted with an ethical dilemma, how do I go about resolving it? So let's take, for example, you've been hired to be an assistant controller at ABC Corporation, and they're going to pay you $75,000 to be their assistant controller. Now, that's a lot of money coming out of business school. You're really excited. Well, here comes the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, who comes down, gives you a big high five, and says, look, Louise, we wanted you in this department, in this position, because we know you're a team player. We are counting on you to be a team player. You're a team player, aren't you, Louise? Give me another high five. So you're excited. Everybody in the office is excited to have you there. You're all excited. Well, before he leaves, the CFO says, look, Louise, before I depart, let me tell you, one of the most important things you're going to be doing in your position is the assistant controller. You prepare the quarterly returns for the company. Now, like General Electric, we report 6% quarterly returns. We've got all of our Wall Street investment houses. We've got shareholders. We've got all sorts of folks who are watching those quarterly returns like a hawk. And so it's critical that we show consistent quarterly returns. We're not an up and down company. We are a stable company that methodically returns a profit to our shareholders. So he gives you another high five and out you go. So out he goes, and the quarter passes by, and you've been, crunching the numbers, and you discover, oh my, the numbers only add up to a 5.6% quarterly return, not 6%. Oh my, what am I going to do? Well, you've got a spendthrift spouse who is just deadly with a credit card. You've got 11 children, 6 of whom have serious illnesses of one type or another. You need this company's medical plan. You've got mountains of college debt that you need to service. You need this job. What to do? Are you conflicted? Are you feeling a little stress? You need this job. You've got bills at home. You've got sick children. You've got college debt. You need this job. You know the CFO's coming down shortly for his quarterly report. What are you going to report? 5.6% or 6% that he's looking for? You need this job. Are you conflicted? I would suggest most normal people would feel conflicted. How do you deconflict the dilemma that you're in to decide correctly? Oh, Professor Huck, that's easy for you to say. You don't have all these sick kids and mountains of debt and a spendthrift spouse. Oh, man, what am I going to do? Well, that's where schools of ethical thought can come into play to help you decide correctly. So let's take, for example, the ethical fundamentalism principle, which says, look, if you have some type of outside ethical guideline like a Bible or Quran or the Ten Commandments, the code of conduct for transnational corporations, you've got some source of ethical guidelines that act as a compass to point you in the correct decision-making direction. So, applying the fundamentalism principle point of view, we would say, it would probably be wrong to report anything other than a 6% quarterly return. But what about the ethical relativist principle? This is the one that has gotten a number of people in lots of trouble. So it says that, look, people look at these ethical dilemmas through their own personal lens. of what is right and wrong. And so the Wall Street movie is going to be a good example of ethics on display, of looking at business exclusively through the lens of one's own personal interest. Another school of ethical principles is the utilitarian principle that says, look, you should choose the action, the decision, that provides the greatest good to society. I like that great scene in Star Trek where Spock says, look, as he's about to die, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And so that would most likely put you in the category again of recommending, geez, I think 6% is what we need to report, not 5.6. Another school of thought would say the categorical imperative. That is, well, we'll make a decision providing everybody else can make it in a similar way. So if I falsely report the quarterly returns for that to be ethical or the right thing to do under these circumstances, then it must be okay for everybody else to do that too. Well, can you imagine a business world where everybody falsely reported numbers? One of my favorites is the Norman Vincent Peale. He was a Archbishop of Canterbury many years ago, and he came up with 3 simple questions that he said everybody should ask themselves these questions when faced with a ethical dilemma. First, is it legal? Well, we would agree it's not legal to falsely report quarterly returns. Those returns are not only going to go to Wall Street, they're going to go to the Securities Exchange Commission and all sorts of other people. So the answer to that would be, no, it's not legal. Well, guess what? You don't do what is not legal. But assume for the moment somehow you can get around that first question. He would say, ask the second question. Is it fair or balanced? Is it fair or balanced to falsely report quarterly returns? And again, I bet we could get a consensus to say, no, it's not. Lastly, how does it make me feel? Probably not good, because you feel conflicted. You don't want to do the unethical, let alone the illegal act. And so you feel terrible. And so that would be another way to use an ethical compass to deconflict. Now, it's not to say this is going to be easy. It's not to say there's going to be no pain or even repercussions. But the question is, what is the right thing to do? John Rawls, in his Rawlsian justice principles, would say, look, what should the rules for society be if we faced a veil of ignorance? That is, if we didn't know what the rules were, what would the right thing to be? I like the front page test. What would happen if your quarterly return report appeared on the front page of a newspaper with your name on it? That you, as the assistant controller, reported 6% quarterly returns for ABC Corporation? How would you like to see your name up in lights on that? And then, of course, the repercussions. Page 33 of your text talks about Abraham Lincoln and all the actions he took, some of which were unethical in order to try and get the 14th Amendment enacted by Congress. Interesting. And so I recommend you read that and ask the ethical questions. Was President Lincoln ethical in his behavior? So, how about some of these questions? Good health, companionship, and enjoyable leisure activities all contribute more to happiness than money. True or false? Actually, there's a lot of truth to that because money is neutral. Research shows the impact of money on happiness disappears when income exceeds $75,000. True or false? Would you believe that also is true? How about this? Creative people tend to be more ethical than others. False. Creative people are better at rationalizing their bad behavior. True or false? That happens to be true. So how about some of these examples? These are excuses, if you will, that people who cross the ethical line and decide wrongly, unethically, these are the excuses that they come up with. How about this? How many of you think you are fairly objective in decision making? Believe it or not, most people are not objective when comparing themselves to others. That is a true statement, that people are not terribly objective when comparing themselves to others. So how do we define a conflict of interest? Well, it's when your personal needs, as I illustrated for you with the assistant controller position, get caught up with institutional requirements, if you will. And so these are some of the things that employees have been asked to do, and that they knowingly, willingly, intelligently, voluntarily engaged in wrongly. What's the problem with just going with the flow? So what helps us to avoid ethics traps? I think these are some aids, if you will, some things that you can employ to help arrive at a correct decision when you're faced with a moral dilemma. First, slow down the thinking process. I used to always sleep on it overnight. No matter what the ethical decision was, I always wanted to sleep on it overnight, and that really helped me. Don't trust your first instinct. You need to think them through, and I think sleeping on them overnight is a good start. And then, of course, asking the question, what are your life principles? What are your life principles? And then applying them consistently, not just when it's convenient. I've had a number of ethical problems I've been faced with. One was a family situation where the family members did not want mother told that she was terminal with cancer. I think they were really worried themselves about having to endure what would obviously be difficult with mother's gradual decline. But the doctor looked at me and I looked at him and I says, "What's your ethical duty, doctor?" And he looked at the floor and he looked up at me and he said, "I've got to tell her." And I said, "Of course you've got to tell her, but your family's going to be upset." And I said, "Well, that's just too bad. You've got to tell her." When I taught at West Point from 1980 to 83, the cadets used to always try out these crazy ethical problems on me, because their honor code says simply that a cadet will not lie, steal, or cheat, nor tolerate those that do. They would give me examples of where their ethics would be tested. So one of the examples I recall vividly was a cadet's invited to the home of his tactical officer for dinner. And the tactical officer's wife imprudently serves liver. Now, the cadet hates liver. And so at the conclusion of the dinner, the tactical officer's wife asks, "Well, cadet, how did you enjoy the liver?" A cadet will not lie, steal, or cheat, nor tolerate those that do. Interesting ethical dilemma. And this is where, I found one has to be sophisticated in one's response as opposed to lying. So clearly it is highly problematic for the cadet to say, "I hate liver, Mrs. Tactical Officer. It was horrible." I think we can all agree that's highly problematic. But let's get sophisticated here. Let's put the brain in gear. which is what the cadets do. It's like, oh, man, this was really interesting. I haven't had this meal in ages. A true statement, right? A true statement. He didn't lie. And so I think sophistication can be called for in ethical situations to avoid acute embarrassment. Should you behave in the workplace ethically different than the way you do at home? What do you think? No, false. You should not behave differently. You should be the same person at work as you are at home. Your ethics should be the same. How about companies that produce formaldehyde, that expose consumers to dangerous, chemicals? Is it ethical to try and get Congress to terminate funding for research regarding that type of health hazard? What would Immanuel Kant with his universalism principle or John Stuart Mill with his utilitarian principle have to say about that? I like this one. A tornado destroys your manufacturing plant in Timbuktu, South Dakota. The plant employs 2,000 of the 3,000 inhabitants of the town. It is 150 miles from the next largest community. The company's insurance covers full cost of replacement. But a financial study reveals the company could make more profit by transferring the manufacturing operation to a sweatshop facility in Upper Slovovia. So what ethics should guide this decision? And so what's the utilitarian principle? How does that guide us here? How does Immanuel Kant's universalism principle work? How does my good friend, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Norman Vincent Peale, is it legal to move the plant to Upper Slovovia and have it operate, at much cheaper cost? Yeah, that's legal. Is it fair or balanced under the circumstances? Doesn't sound that way to me. So how does it make you feel? Probably not very good. So again, these are some questions that I think bear, answering. How do you respond to the unethical behavior in others? Well, what's the extent of your loyalty? I mean, my company, good, bad, or indifferent? At what point, have you ever thought about it? At what point would you exit employment of your current employer? How do you voice opposition to wrongdoing? I've been in lots of those situations. And again, sophistication, I think, is helpful by simply disagreeing without becoming disagreeable. One of my bosses told me early on that he thought I was excessively disagreeable. And I asked some of my colleagues about that, and they said, well, Huck, you really are. You can be mean at times. And so I had to change because I was disagreeable. And so I think it is true. You can disagree without becoming disagreeable. And again, I think sophistication comes into to play here. So what is corporate social responsibility today? Well, we clearly need business to give back and obviously to be sensitive to stakeholders in the conduct of its business. Why is government regulation a necessity? Certainly to preserve the competitive process, to achieve social goals that are extrinsic to the allocation of resources. These are important, questions. So what ethics do you choose in your business? Well, of course, it depends on what type of business you're running. Sometimes the golden rule is all your particular, business may need. And so I am in the camp that argues that business does have an obligation of social responsibility. It's not all about me, because at the end of the day, What do you want on your tombstone? What do you want said of you? So these are interesting, business questions that are deserving of reflection and an answer. Um, Again, thinking about these things, especially overnight when they involve important decisions, I think helps generate correct answers. Nobody said ethical questions can be resolved easily or without pain. Sometimes they are the choice of two almost equally awful options. For example, laying people off. One of the hardest things I had to do was not only select, but also tell employees that they were being laid off. I couldn't imagine anything more horrific than having to do that. And having gone through it, I'm here to tell you it's a highly emotional um, endeavor, and it's something you have to give a lot of thought to and consideration before you do it, so that you do it in as kind an informed way as you possibly can. Well, these are the things that I wanted to share with you today in our first session. I hope they are helpful to you. I again invite you to send me any emails regarding any questions, operational or substantive, that may come to your mind. Because again, my whole purpose in here is to help you, to act as your Sherpa on this trip together. So with that, boys and girls, until next week, stay well. Bye-bye.